Hello and welcome back to the Argyle Talent Acquisition Summit, Hire, Retain, Engage. My name is Michael with Argyle, and it's great to have everyone joining us today. Before I turn the floor over to our esteemed keynote speaker, just a quick reminder, we want to hear from you. So to ask questions throughout the session, simply type into the Q&A chat, and we will address your questions at the end of the session. And now without further delay, I'd like to introduce our speaker, Rob Markovic, Vice President, Global Talent Acquisition with PHC Group. We're excited to have Rob for his keynote presentation titled, Who Do You Know? Harness Existing Talent to Beat the Great Quit Culture. Rob, thank you so much for being here with us today. Welcome, and over to you.
All right. Thank you so much, Michael. And thank you, Argyle, for having me today. I am so lucky to be talking about something today that I'm very passionate about, which is internal mobility and how we look at internal talent to fill our open roles or to think about how we engage and attract talent to our companies. So without further ado, I'll jump into it. So first off, give me just a second. There we go. So first off, a few things that we'll be covering today. What is internal mobility and why do we care about it? I think it's important just to set the stage there. The next piece is, why are we looking at internal mobility now? It's interesting. I've seen so many articles recently. A lot of them are actually quoted in this presentation today about internal mobility. So why the focus now? We'll jump into that. We'll talk about some key areas that we can focus on as talent professionals to help the process of internal mobility, succession planning being one of them. Chessboarding or talent pool partnerships, talent exchanges. These are other things that we can do or participate in to help internal mobility in our companies. But you can't do any of this without a good technology platform. So we'll talk a lot about technology platforms and what you should think about when thinking about what do I use to help internal mobility at my company. And last but not least, we'll jump into how you build a program. Now, I want to be very clear. We're not going to build a program here. We've got very limited time. We could literally talk about this all day long and still not get to the point of having a program built out. But I will highlight some key things that I think are very important for you to consider when you're either revamping your internal mobility program or when you're beginning to think about, I really need to build this out, or we need to build this out in our company. So that's what we'll cover today. At the end of the session, we'll have questions. I'll turn it back over to Michael. He'll guide us through those. I don't want you to worry if your question doesn't get answered. Argyle is very good about getting questions to facilitators after the fact so we can still get them answered. So throw it out there when we go, but we'll address questions at the end of the session. All right, so first off and foremost, what is internal mobility and why do we care about it? First off, internal mobility is the movement of employees. And you can think about this as movement vertically or laterally to some sort of new career or developmental opportunity within the business. That could be in the same organization or in a company like mine. I work for a holding company. We have several operating companies underneath us. That could be within operating companies. So anything where an employee is moving and doing something different that engages and develops them. This can include promotions, oddly enough, demotions, depending on the situation, new positions, mentorships, working across team or maybe across a department, taking on additional projects or gig work, job shadowing, job swaps. Any of these things qualify as internal mobility and help us engage and retain our employees. So why is this so important right now, and why do we want to look at it? First off, and I think we all get this, internal mobility can lead to savings in the company. And that's savings in a number of ways. I've seen a study that shows that if you have a strong internal mobility program in your company, you can reduce hiring costs by 20%. So there's some real bottom line savings that you can have, but also savings in productivity, reduced time to fill, things like that. I think a more important piece, though, is that whole concept of engaging talent and making sure that your talent feels appreciated and reducing attrition. So there was a LinkedIn study that came out recently that suggested that 41% of employees in the workplace would stay longer at their current company if internal mobility was a focus that was visible to them, and they knew they had opportunity to grow. This is huge. So we can keep people engaged and wanting to stay at the company if we just put some focus on internal mobility. Another key piece, I think, in internal mobility is the concept of diversity and innovation in the workplace. When we look at our own people and move them around and get them into a different environment where they're sharing their experience and their knowledge and their ideas, we're lucky in the fact that we create some diversity in that team, and we also create innovation, which ultimately leads to bottom line profits. So it's another way of driving innovation in the company by just mixing up the teams and letting new ideas come into play. Lastly, and I think this is important for all of us that are talent acquisition professionals on the call, is the whole concept of, if you have a great internal mobility program and your employees are engaged and they're really interested in staying with the company and moving into other roles, you can use that in your advertising, in your employee value proposition to attract talent to the company. So it helps us attract external talent by focusing on internal talent. All right, so that talks about the what and the why, but why now? And unfortunately, it shifts back to COVID. So there's been an effect of COVID that I think we've all felt, especially as talent acquisition professionals, where the external talent market just isn't the same as it was before. It was always tough to recruit before, and it was always tough to find the right people for the right roles, but the market was viable. Ever since COVID, though, there's been a shift. And that shift is in the concept of traditional employees versus people realizing that, hey, I don't need to work at a full-time Monday through Friday job anymore. I don't need to do this. I can do gig work, or I can work part-time, or maybe I'm going to do something completely different that I've never done before. That shift in the traditional talent market has created a gap in the workforce that makes it even harder for us to attract talent to the company externally, which naturally leads us to think about, well, who do we have internally? Who could work for us inside the company? So that's key. That workforce shift because of COVID is key. I've actually seen a statistic recently, and I'm going off of memory, so please don't quote this, but it was something that I think it was 64% of people still consider themselves traditional employees post-COVID, meaning 36% think there's something different now, think they're gig workers or part-time workers, or maybe just doing something completely different. So that's a large gap that we have to fill. Internal mobility helps that. We already talked on the last slide that 41% of employees will stay if a company has a strong internal mobility program. But the problem is, and there was a Deloitte study that shows that only 6% of employees feel like their company has an excellent program or does an excellent job at enabling internal mobility. So once again, a huge gap. 41% of employees will stay if we have a good program, but only 6% think we have a good program. So we clearly need to do some work around internal mobility now to engage our employees, keep retention up, and help us from a talent acquisition perspective. There's obviously a ton of other reasons why now. Obviously, if you're moving somebody in that already understands the culture, they already know how to work in your environment, that's going to accelerate their productivity. For us in talent acquisition, we love reducing time to fill, so that's another key benefit of looking at it now. But I think that workforce shift is really the key driver there. All right, so we've talked about the how and the why now. So let's talk about what you can do, or maybe some programs that you already have in place that you can take advantage of to help with internal mobility. The first one I'm going to talk about is succession planning. And I want to be very clear here. I'm going to do this very lightly because I'm talent acquisition. Succession really isn't my thing, right? But it's important, I think, for talent acquisition professionals to understand succession planning and to be involved in it because it is a key driver of internal mobility. So let's talk lightly about succession planning, and then we'll dive into some other things that we can get more involved in. So first off and foremost, I think the main reason why we want to look at succession planning is there's been a survey of CEOs around the globe. And one of the key things that they say helps develop people for leadership roles and roles in the company are cross-functional rotations, or the concept of internal mobility. So obviously our leadership believes that this is something that really prepares people for furthering their career within the company. So that's reason enough for us to say, hey, we should take a look at this and pay attention to this. Now, once again, succession planning, not really a talent acquisition function normally. However, succession planning is in partnership with HR, with leadership, and with talent management. And they're really looking at who are our leaders today and how do we make sure we have somebody to replace them as time goes on and they either retire, move into their next role, maybe leave the company, etc. So I think it's important for talent acquisition professionals to really understand the talent in the company and to understand who's high potential and who might have an eye towards leadership, and make sure that we know when positions come up, maybe we should talk to talent management or HR about that person. I think that also leads to another component of succession planning, which is understanding talent readiness. So if we know there's people that might be ready for roles and we know that they've got the skills in the background that might fill some roles internally for us, we need to understand if they're ready now, or maybe they'll be ready in 1 to 6 months, and we can begin to plant those seeds of, hey, this person might be good for that role that you might have opening up soon. Or maybe they're not going to be ready for 2 to 3 years, and it's something that we just need to move on from. I think that's another key piece, is understanding white space in the succession plan. So working with talent management and HR to say, okay, where is there white space? Is there anybody that's going to be eventually ready internally for that role? Or do we need to think about external hiring? So this is how I think talent acquisition gets involved in succession planning. I'd be interested to hear from some of you all in the questions if you do it differently in your organization. So succession planning is one tool that we use to think about internal mobility, but there are many others, and a lot of companies have a lot of great things in place to help out that I think talent acquisition gets highly involved in. So let's talk about some of those. So you might have heard the term chessboarding, or literally moving pieces around the board, so moving employees around the board to position them for the next role. Or talent pool partnerships, where you partner with maybe another department or another organization, in my case, maybe another operating company, to think about who's in your talent pool now that needs a developmental opportunity that you could use, and who's in your talent pool that I could use. And then that leads to these talent exchanges, where we begin to think about moving people across the organization. So these are all basically saying the same thing. It's an organized way of evaluating talent across the organization, very tied to workforce planning. So what's coming up in our future and what do we need to be prepared for? Preparing people for that, looking at leadership roles through succession planning, or also if we have a known vacancy, or we know maybe somebody's moving into a new role and that their position is going to be vacant. So really having an organized way of discussing this and talking about it. It's typically held between HR in coordination with the business, talent management, and talent acquisition. And the concept is that you have an open dialogue about what internal talent could fill some of these upcoming roles or upcoming needs, something that's on the workforce plan, or maybe a project that's coming up, or maybe you have an acquisition, or you're going into a new product line and you need to develop some salespeople. Whatever the case may be, you, talent acquisition professional with talent management and HR, tying in the business, are talking about who are the people that could potentially fill these roles, and how do we get them ready for those roles. That piece is key, because if we have this conversation and we're really looking into workforce planning, then we know we have the ability to say, okay, this person's not ready now, but maybe we can upskill them, or maybe we can reskill them to be ready, because they would be perfect for that role 6 months from now. So we begin to have these conversations from an overall HR perspective of who can fill internal roles. And then we're always thinking internally. External becomes secondary at that point, which is easier for us in the long run. All right, so we're doing this. The one thing that I would caveat this, and I've seen this done really well in the past, and I've also seen it done poorly. If you set up some sort of chessboarding or talent exchange, something like this, where you're doing this routine kind of check in on who's the talent and what's open, what's available, or what's coming up, you really need to come prepared to these conversations, because nothing is more disengaging in this process than if you're the talent acquisition professional and you've come with 4 roles that are coming up that are key roles in the company, and you think there might be internal talent for, and the other person says, you're asking the question, who can fill this role? And the other person says, you know what, I don't really have anybody, or I don't know, I haven't really thought about it. Very disengaging. So coming prepared, being ready to have this conversation is key. Okay, so now we've talked about a couple ways that you can activate internal mobility, but we haven't really engaged our employees yet in this process in the things that we've talked about yet. And we also haven't really talked about how we do it. So I think the next piece that's important for us to consider is technology, and what kind of technology we need to enable internal mobility in the company. Now, the good news is that a vast majority of us have strong HRMS platforms that actually have the ability to do talent mobility internally very easily. Doesn't mean that we're necessarily taking advantage of it, but the ability is there to enable it. So doing things like talent cards or building out talent profiles, being able to do internal search, allowing internal candidates to see openings, things like that. So that technology is there for a lot of us. But just in case it's not, or just in case you're in a situation where you're just not pleased with your HRMS system and you want to look externally, there are many software platforms out there now that have the ability to really help you with this internal mobility engagement, this agility engagement of your workforce. Typical features of these include having an internal talent marketplace. So that concept of a place where employees can go to see what open roles are there, what they need to get those roles, or what may be coming up. It also gives skill visibility. One of the things I think we realize that our internal employees have that we don't necessarily see is they may have skills from other jobs that aren't relevant to their current role, but may be relevant to their next role. So being able to highlight those skills is key. A lot of these software platforms give that ability. A lot of them are very savvy in tying in with your learning management system. So you can do the upskilling or reskilling with the employee where they kind of control it. They can look and see that a job requires this skill. Maybe it's a software skill, they don't have it. There's coursework in the LMS, so it'll tie them to the LMS to be able to take that coursework so they can upskill to be ready for that next opportunity that they're interested in. So that's a really great point in helping employees feel engaged in the process and be part of the process of their own mobility. If your company has built out career pathing, you can have that uploaded into it so people can see what their next step is in their current role, or maybe in another area that they're looking at or another department, what the pathing is for that. And once again, maybe prepare themselves for that with that upskilling piece. You get reporting, so you have the ability to easily see, okay, who's ready now, or who's available for this type of role in this location, or how many people have we filled internally this year. And then some of the platforms are so savvy, they actually help you with the change management within your organization as you begin to focus on internal mobility. So a lot of great features. So it may be something you want to look at. I'm not going to talk about any specific companies now, but feel free to reach out to me afterwards if you want some ideas there. So once again, many of our HR management systems or ATSs have the ability to do search of internal profiles. They have the ability to have employees fill out talent cards or talent profiles, but there's some things to consider here. And this is once again where you have to engage your employee population. First off, a talent card does no good if it's not filled out, or a talent profile does no good if it's not filled out. So there has to be some form of encouragement within the company to get employees to actually fill out their talent profiles, mark where their locations they're interested in, fill out that information of, hey, I did this in my previous job, that might be useful for us to utilize them in their next job. So that's something that really engages the employees and is critical in this working from a search perspective. The other piece, if you do go into this thinking about your software platform as an ability to search for internal talent first, your recruiters have to have guidelines and clear governance on how they can reach out to internals. Nothing is more disengaging to an employee than they get reached out to by a recruiter saying, hey, we've got this opportunity. But as it turns out, the recruiter didn't have all the information on that employee, and maybe they're not eligible for the next role. Maybe they just moved into a new role. Maybe there's already a plan for them in their development, and then they don't get that opportunity. So it's really crucial to set up strong process and guidelines around this. All right, so we've talked about how to do this, we've talked about why to do this, and now we've talked about platforms to help us do this. So how do we build out an internal mobility program in the company? The first thing that I want to say is this is just a guide, just to help you think about it more. It's very specific to your company and your situation. The next thing that I want to highlight is this is not a long-term solution, or this is a long-term solution for talent. It's not a quick fix. If you haphazardly build out an internal mobility program and don't really stick with it, you will disengage your employees, and it will actually be a detractor rather than an attractor. So it's really critical to think about it as a long-term solution for talent. That being said, it doesn't mean that you as a talent acquisition person can't go to your HR person or your talent management person and say, hey, I've got this opening. Is there anybody internal that can fill this opening? They'll certainly be able to help you quickly on the spot, but that's not a program. We're talking about building out a program here. First off and foremost, very obvious, leadership has to embrace and own internal mobility. If your leader does not believe that internal mobility is the way to solve some of these problems we've talked about today, it's not going to go anywhere. So they have to embrace it and continuously communicate it. The next piece, and this is a hard one for people like myself, talent acquisition professionals to swallow, is this isn't our process. Internal mobility is actually more of a talent management or an HR process with the business. However, we are highly engaged in it, and sometimes it does end up being our responsibility. So we enable and facilitate it through filling jobs with internal individuals. So it's important for us to be engaged throughout this process. And we can drive the conversation of getting it started if you don't have a strong platform to get it started with. All right, the next piece, and this is probably the most critical, is preparing your internal culture for this focus on internal mobility. This is huge change management. And what I mean by that, and I think this will resonate, is that there are many managers that believe that their talent is their talent and they're not going to share that talent. They're talent hoarders. And they will do anything to keep a person from moving away from the role that they're in. And they'll tell you that they've got a development plan for them, or the business will fail if that person's not in that role. And so changing that mindset takes a long time and a lot of work, and it's work around every aspect of HR to help facilitate a new discussion, a discussion around you are actually a great leader if you're developing talent that does move within the company to another role, because you're helping engage our employees and retain our employees. So that's the focus, is shifting that mindset from I need that person to I develop people. I had a talent management leader in the past who did a great job of selling this concept of I gave talent today. You get a medal, and it was well advertised that you developed somebody that moved into a new role. So it put some pride into the concept of developing people and allowing them to move into other roles. So you have to change that mindset within your company. The other piece, and a lot of times when we talk about internals, we're very opaque about that person might be good for this role. Transparency is key in a good internal mobility program. People have to understand what they need to do to get to the next level, what career pathing opportunities are, how to engage and how to look for internal roles, how to fill out their profiles so people will understand that they have abilities to take on internal roles. So being transparent and getting your employees engaged in the process is key. Once again, you have to have clear guidelines and processes. We talked about that before for understanding and success. Nothing disengages hiring managers or internal employees more if they come into the internal mobility process and nothing happens, or they don't hear anything, or they don't know what's going on, and it's confusing. So clear process guidelines built throughout. And then lastly, tying it all together with solid technology. This facilitates both the process, but also the candidate experience. We saw that if a candidate can engage, if an internal candidate can engage and do things to upskill or do things to prepare themselves for their next role, or to make it clear that they have skills and abilities that we might not be aware of. That's super engaging, and it's great candidate experience, and it allows for a good feeling, a good engagement piece, a good retention piece all the way across the board. All right, so I want to wrap up now so we have a little bit of time for questions. So thank you so much for listening to me. I'm very passionate about this, something I care a lot about, and I know you do too. So Michael, I'll turn it back to you for questions.
Thank you, Rob. It's an insightful presentation. We appreciate you being here. And as a reminder, audience members can still enter questions. And we're now going to review some of the ones that came through. So Rob, here's our first question.
Okay.
We are struggling to get the most out of our existing talent. I feel like there's gas in the tank that we're just not getting to. Do you have any advice for us?
Yeah, that's a tricky one, and that's not necessarily a talent acquisition one per se. What I would say is engaging with talent management, finding out how you're developing employees, or what processes are in place to develop employees, doing things like engaging the learning management system so employees can upskill themselves and learn themselves, I think are key. But also, once again, going back to the technology piece, making sure that you know what gas is in the tank, making sure you understand what your employees actually bring to the table. That's a solid partnership with talent management.
Yes, thank you. Our next question, what's the biggest mistake you've seen companies make in increasing their training and upskilling efforts? And how did they get past this?
Yeah, I think for me, and I think this probably varies per company, but for me, it's that whole not having strong process in place. That leads to two things. Number one, engaging people that might not be engageable. A recruiter might engage an internal person who's actually on a PIP and about to be moved out of the business, right? And nothing is worse than getting a hiring manager engaged and an employee engaged, and they're not a viable candidate. I think another piece is that whole concept of the process. If people feel lost, if you're an internal and you apply for a job and you never hear anything, or you're a hiring manager and you think you're going to talk to an internal that has expressed interest and nothing ever happens, super disengaging. And so I think putting process in place, being very clear about that, is key to correct that.
Thank you. Our next question, without an ATS, do you have other strategies for maintaining a talent inventory?
Yeah, it's difficult without an ATS, to be honest. So I feel your pain there. I think if there is any budget to do one of these other alternate sources for internal talent, so there's a lot of software platforms out there that can really help with that and allow people to engage via a system. That's what I would recommend. If not, it's really doing that hands-on partnering with talent management and HR to make sure you, as a talent acquisition person, understand what potential talent is in the company, what they have to bring to the table, and then facilitating those conversations. You know, not letting those people go by the by, making sure that you're engaged with everybody to make sure that we look at those internals.
Nice, thank you so much. We're just about out of time. Do you have a quick moment on final thoughts, and can we keep up with you through social media?
Yeah, absolutely. So once again, I think every talent acquisition person should be highly engaged in the internal mobility process. For us, just simply put, if we're filling higher level roles internally and moving people internally, people are engaged, they're not going to leave. So it gives us less work on replacements. And it also makes our work easier by working on lower level roles. So I think that's key in and of itself. But realistically, that attraction piece, if you have a strong program, being able to advertise that externally is a great talent attractor for when you do have to go external. So get involved, get engaged with talent management and HR to really drive this in your company. I highly recommend it, and it works well if you work it well. Also, on the social media piece, feel free to reach me on LinkedIn at any time. And I'm not sure if Argyle gives out our email addresses, but you can reach out to me there and I'll be more than happy to connect.
That's great, Rob. We appreciate that. And thank you so much. Well, I want to thank everyone for joining us today. This was a fantastic keynote. Now, this session, along with all of today's content, will be available on demand following the event. Rob, thank you so much.
Thank you very much.